Hello, my name is Noemie and I am a correspondent for The Forge. This is the Notable Leftists and Revolutionaries series. Today, I will be talking to you about Assata Shakur. So one thing that fascinated me about Assata Shakur is that she and I had a similar upbringing in many ways. She was taught to be proud, very proud. I was too, for different things and different reasons, but we were given this same sort of respectability speech. She and I both were brought up with certain kinds of cultural items like museums of fine arts and musical theater. So she experienced those things at a young age, and I was fortunate enough to be able to have that as well. She also had sort of what seems like a fascination with big cities. I share that fascination. She and I both went to big cities by ourselves secretly, like during the day, to engage in culture, not really to do anything unsavory or inappropriate for a kid. Like I would go to Chicago to go to the Mexican American Museum, for example. And so that's another thing that we have in common. And this is something that a lot of people will have in common with Assata, is that she had a single mom in high school. I had a single mom all my life. And another thing that Assata and I both had in common was like this overarching, looming issue of respectability, living a petite bourgeois lifestyle, meaning having a family that is aspiring to be part of the ownership class. So yeah, I find Assata fascinating for reasons other than her very sharp political analysis. And let's get into the timeline of her life. Assata Shakur was born in 1947, so she was only about 5 or 6 years younger than Kwame Ture. The year that she was born was the year when India and Pakistan won independence from Great Britain. The CIA and the National Security Act were both established under Truman in 1947. So throughout her life, the CIA and NSA were developed and culminated in a lot of trouble for a lot of Black liberation activists. So in 1979, Assata Shakur escaped from prison and escaped persecution. During this Death to the Klan march in Greensboro, North Carolina, white supremacists killed 5 of the marchers in 1979. Meredith Hunter, a young man, was murdered at the Altamont Free concerts by the Hells Angels, and Rhodesia turned into Zimbabwe with the first Black-led government in 9 decades. So 1979, these are the things that were happening when Assata was fleeing persecution. She's still alive today. Let's move on to some basic facts about Assata. Was she actually in the Black Liberation Army? I have a quote to answer that question. She says in her autobiography, "I am a Black revolutionary, and by definition, that makes me part of the Black Liberation Army." Common question, did Assata Shakur actually kill a cop? From a leftist perspective, I'm going to say that's a question for settlers to worry about. So Assata Shakur was a student activist like Kwame Ture. She was an internationalist like Thomas Sankara, and she was part of the original natural hair movement. Speaking of the natural hair movement, let's move on to Assata Shakur and feminism. So this is probably the only regret that I have about her work that I've read, is that she doesn't really engage on the woman question or the gender question as much as I would like her to, being both Black and a woman. However, I noticed that in Assata Shakur's autobiography, she does make an effort to portray trans women in a positive light and have empathy for victims. And so that's when she talks about her own experience in the village when she ran away from home as a teenager. And this is up to trans women to decide whether or not that portrayal was a good or fair one or good for trans women in general. I noticed that in the autobiography, Assata Shakur does call Miss Shirley a man. So in my experience, I've learned that someone without an explicit line on communism is not a communist. They're not a secret communist. That doesn't exist. We can't afford to just trust that people are somehow on the DL like one of us. So by that token, I have to say that no explicit line on feminism just means that the person's not a feminist. One thing that Assata does talk about regarding feminism is that she says that all liberation movements are far removed from women on Rikers. At Rikers, all the liberation movements, gender, race, class, all of that is very far removed from the prisoners there, as she writes in the 1980s. Let's move on to quotes from Assata Shakur. Here's the first one about the events in 1975 in her autobiography. Every day there were 3 shifts of police. When they changed shifts, the 2 troopers would salute the sergeants. Some saluted an army salute, but others saluted like Nazis did in Germany. They held their hands in front of them and clicked their heels. One day, one of them came in and gave me a speech about how he fought in World War II on the wrong side. He went on, and there was no question that he believed everything he said. He said that if Hitler had won, the world wouldn't be in the mess it is today. So this means that people in the Black liberation movement have known, at least since the 1970s, that American police officers were straight up Nazis. We've known that for decades. So when it comes to police officers, I think that we should really lower our expectations for them. These conversations about police officers and their affiliations and quote-unquote good cops, this sort of sheds light on how useful that sort of rhetoric is. Okay, so the next quote is as follows. I had 3 bullet holes. There was a bullet in my chest, it's still there, an injured lung with fluid in it, a broken clavicle, and a paralyzed arm with undetermined damage to nerves. I kept asking if I would be able to use my hand again. 1 or 2 doctors said flatly, no. The other said, maybe yes, maybe no. Anyway, I was gonna live. So this is from Assata's autobiography describing her time after she was in that car wreck, and then she was accused of killing a state trooper in New Jersey. Also within the hospital, she experienced torture, like detectives putting things in her eyes to burn them. She wasn't sure if she was ever going to see again, sticking fingers in her wounds, poking her, causing her pain. She was denied medical treatment. So this is from her autobiography. It's a very, very fascinating read. I recommend it. Okay, let's talk about why Assata Shakur is important. And to do that, I'd like to point to this quote about communism. At first, I viewed it suspiciously, as some kind of white man's concoction, until I read the works by African revolutionaries and studied the African liberation movements. Revolutionaries in Africa understood that the question of African liberation was not just a question of race, that even if they managed to get rid of white colonialists, if they didn't rid themselves of the capitalistic economic structure, the white colonialists would simply be replaced by black neo-colonialists. There was not a single liberation movement in Africa that was not fighting for socialism. In fact, there was not a single liberation movement in the whole world that was fighting for capitalism. The whole thing boiled down to a simple equation. Anything that has any kind of value is made, mined, grown, produced, and processed by working people. So why shouldn't working people collectively own that wealth? Why shouldn't working people own and control their own resources? Capitalism meant that rich businessmen owned the wealth, while socialism meant that the people who made the wealth owned it. So I think this is really important too, because often people say they're not a socialist because they don't want to work hard and have someone else be able to benefit from their hard work. But when you really think about it, that's all capitalism is. When you're a worker, you're working so that someone else can steal your wages in the form of profits. So this is why Assata Shakur is very, very important for us as leftists. And she does have a lot of theory that overlaps with Black Marxist feminists too, such as this really, really important pointing out of the fact that white colonialists could be replaced with black neo-colonialists. That's not outside of possibilities if we don't fight for socialism. So thank you so much for watching this video on Assata Shakur for the Forge's Notable Leftists and Revolutionaries series. My name is Noemie. Stay tuned for more videos.